Hola a todos y a todas. Volvemos aquí para ya la última sesión de la mañana. Vamos a hacer la primera parte del segundo día de Food Design Festival. Y es un lujo para mí presentar a Fabio Parasecoli, que estará con nosotros ahora y va a dar una charla. Nos va a hablar sobre Global Brooklyn, sobre Food, Spaces and Design. Solo deciros que Fabio es profesor de Food Studies en el Departamento de Nutrición and Food Studies de la New York University, como muchos de vosotros sabréis, y su investigación explora la interacción de la comida y la política cultural. Particularmente se centra en medios y en diseño. Así que, Fabio, todo tuyo. Un gusto tenerte aquí con nosotros.
Yeah, I'm going to speak English. It's going to be easier. So thank you for the invitation. I'm very excited to share my work the last couple of years. As a matter of fact, I'm going to share the screen. Okay. There we go. So what is Global Brooklyn, and how did this project start? It is a book now, a little of self-promotion never hurt. The book came out in January this year with Bloomsbury in London. And I co-edited together with Mateusz Halaba, who's a researcher at the Polish Academy of Science in Warsaw. Now, how did I end up doing this kind of work with somebody in Poland? So we are working together on a large project about the revaluation of regional and traditional foods in Poland. And so we were going around and looking at restaurants and places where people eat and buy food. And we immediately realized that there were certain themes that were recurring in the places where we went, in terms of style, in terms of design, in terms of the uses of space. In these images, you can see on the left an abandoned warehouse that during the summer is turned into sort of a cool hanging out place where you can eat and drink coffee and have a cocktail in Warsaw. And on the right, it's also a cafe in Warsaw, which has some elements of cafes that you can see in other places, although it has the peculiarity of the posters. As you may know, Poland has got a very important tradition of printed posters. And so in both cases, there were lots of elements that we felt familiar. And this is an experience that you might have too. You end up in places that you don't know, and like, okay, this feels like, you know, something I know. So that's the beginning of our research. What are these elements that allow us to be in Warsaw or in Rome or in Madrid or in New York and be in places that feel the same, where we have a similar experience when it comes...
Sorry, Fabio. Sorry to interrupt you. Basically, we don't see the slides. We just see, you need to share the whole screen so we can see, we just see the first one, like Global Brooklyn, Food, Space and Design.
You don't see the...
We don't see the full things, no. If you share, maybe you need to share the whole screen and then put full screen on the slides.
Let me try again. That's what I was doing. So I'll
Perfect.
do it again. So I do share. I do the screen, the total screen. Okay.
Yes.
Entire screen. Okay, and then I go on the presentation. Can you see now?
Perfect now. Super.
Okay. All right. Sorry about that. I had tried some other things, but it didn't work. So yeah, these are the places I was talking about in Warsaw. And thank you for pointing out, because I'll be using a lot of images. If you guys didn't see the images, that would have been a problem. So yes, the research started as an attempt to understand why places where people eat and buy food might feel the same no matter where you are. You might be in New York, in Warsaw, or in Madrid. So this is the beginning of the research that ended up with this book that came out in February, Global Brooklyn, Designing Food Experiences in World Cities. And we published it with Bloomsbury. In the book, we asked designers, food scholars, but also writers, food activists around the world to tell us how this experience that we decided to call Global Brooklyn was like where they are. And here on the map, you can see where the different, our different contributors wrote from. We wanted to really give a sense that this style of cafes, of stores, of restaurant has become really global. And so we have places from Cape Town to Mumbai to Rio de Janeiro to Paris. And it's been quite interesting to have people with different experiences, but also in very different places, looking at similar expressions in the way space and design are used around food. Also, we decided to do some sort of crowdsourcing, and we created this hashtag, Global Brooklyn, asking people to post on their social media using the hashtag, so that there was a sort of repository that we could also use for research and see, you know, what things look like, I don't know, in Copenhagen or in Seoul in Korea. And then we also asked people to share pictures, and we created a gallery. And you might, if you're interested, you can look at it on my website, which is Parasecoli, oneword.com, Parasecoli.com, and there is the Global Brooklyn Gallery at the moment. And we gathered pictures, as you can see here. I was in Kerala, in Calicut, for a trip. I took pictures and I shared it there, but contributors, friends, former students. So it was also interesting to work on a global design project with people that were around the world. And I think for designers, this can be something useful to think about. How do you get information? How can you get insights from places that are far away? How can you leverage social media and the internet to do your work? So why Global Brooklyn? Because this specific style very often is connected by its users, by people, by restaurateurs, by customers. It's connected to Brooklyn. Brooklyn has become this very iconic place in New York City. It used to be a very working class part of the city, composed of various neighborhoods, very often ethnic neighborhoods. And over the years, there has been a constant influx, first of artists, and then students and young people, and now there is a full-on gentrification. We'll talk more about that. And with this demographic change, there has been also the appearance of these places that have a particular style and a particular approach to design. And I'll explain more closely what I'm talking about in a second. So we decided to call it Global Brooklyn, but in reality, the origins of this aesthetic approach, of this approach to design and space, are a little bit more complicated. We see elements in Berlin. After the fall of the wall, there were lots of abandoned spaces that were turned into cafes and restaurants and cocktail bar. And so they used the built environment that was cheap and available at the time. And so there was this sense of the post-industrial, sort of the abandoned place, and you know, the decay, the parts that are not so cute become part of the aesthetic. And the same thing happened in other places, for instance, in Portland and Seattle in the US, in some places in Montreal, in London. So the origins of this aesthetics is very much diffused among different places. But for some reason, now many people identify it with Brooklyn. We think it's because of the power of American media. So Brooklyn is showcased in movies, it's showcased on TV series, it's showcased on newspapers and magazines. And so probably many people have connected that aesthetic with Brooklyn because of this. But it's just a way of calling it. We are not trying to say that the origin of this aesthetics is actually in Brooklyn. However, now all over the place, you can see this aesthetics. Here you have two images from Thailand, for instance. There is a mix of global Brooklyn elements and a mix of local elements, and this is also something quite interesting. What are the global Brooklyn elements? Let's start with the design. So first of all, there is an interest for upcycled or recycled materials. It can be wood, it can be iron. If it's rusty, it's not a problem. It gives more of a sense of grittiness, of real material. You can see, for instance, Edison bulbs that you can see in the little picture on the right. Those are very common lighting fixtures, together with other sort of industrial style lighting. You can see the wires, the sort of the mechanics of it are made visible. The bulb is visible. And we can see this with other elements of the architecture. For instance, the water pipes, the electric wiring, the kitchen exhausts, the AC pipes, everything is left visible. When possible, bricks are left visible, cement is left visible, so there is no plastering, no beautification. The elements of the construction are turned into architectural features. Another element that is very common is blackboards. You can see blackboards where you can have the menu of the cafe or the restaurant or the store. The blackboards can be used to leave messages, to write manifestos. But there is this element of the blackboard with very whimsical, very cute, colorful fonts. The element of the fonts, it's also quite important because there is a lot of focus on the fonts of menus and anything that is printed. And you can see that there is a design approach to it because the same aesthetics, the same fonts, the same colors are used on the menu, on the website, on social media. So design has a real central role in this sort of aesthetics. Another element that comes to mind is the potted plants. You go to these cafes that are full of little pots in little containers or hanging from the ceiling. From the point of view of the spaces, there is a certain preference for buildings that had a previous life, a previous use, and very often they were connected with production. They were industrial places. Many of the locations that are turned into global Brooklyn places look like what you see on the left here. Recently, I was in Danzig in northern Poland, and I went to the stockyards where the Solidarność workers movement started. And now many of those buildings have been turned into cafes and restaurants and galleries, or a mix of cafe, gallery, store. On the right, it's a place in Tijuana, in Mexico. It also used to be an old warehouse, and now it is a cinema, It is a cocktail bar, and here you can see the part that is a mezcal bar. So you can see the industrial original elements are highlighted. They become aesthetic features. You can see on the top the beams, the metal beams, the brick walls on the side, the big windows. But then elements of Global Brooklyn are added. You can see the hanging Edison bulbs. You can see the recycled wood and metal, but you can also see a touch of Mexico. And in this case are the azulejos, you know, the ceramics that are used to decorate. And this is something that we will see all over the place, a certain tension between this global aesthetic, but also the desire of bringing something that it's really of the place, that it's really local. Other elements, this is not so much part of the aesthetics, but eventually does get reflected in the aesthetic, is the centrality of sustainability, the centrality of the idea of the circular economy, this sense that we have to do something. We cannot keep on producing. We cannot keep on adding things. We have to become better at using what we have, at respecting the environment. And so when it comes to food and drinks and coffees, many of those are also very much sustainable. They might be connected with fair trade, for instance, in the case of coffee. They might be natural or orange wines when it comes to wine. So wines that are supposedly less artificial in a way, or at least are experienced as less artificial. We think that this focus on sustainability that ends up being reflected also in the aesthetics is a consequence of the fact that many of the customers are younger people, millennials or Generation X and Z, for whom sustainability and the environment and climate change especially have become very central issues with also a certain political importance. The aesthetics has been quickly adopted also in other places that are not connected with food. And so, for instance, hotels, boutique hotels have really attached themselves to these aesthetics. Here, a couple of examples. On the left, it's a hotel from New York City. The one on the right, it's in New Orleans. In a way, they are different, but also they have the same feel. They highlight the environment where they are, the original features, both were industrial places or warehouses. So let's feature the beams, the metal columns, the windows, the original floors, the original ceilings. Sometimes, and this is where it becomes quite interesting, when those features are not there, they are added to give this feel of post-industrial. So this is, you know, a little excessive, but it's known that sometimes designers who realize that this look has become quite popular use those elements and they add them when the building or the location doesn't have them in the first place. What's the result of this? It's what we've called decentralized sameness. What does it mean? Look at these two places. On the left, it's a pasta place. They make handmade pasta, artisanal pasta on my street here in Rome. At the moment, I'm in my apartment in Rome, and it's 100 meters away. On the right, it's a bakery in Rio de Janeiro. And somehow, although, you know, the details might be different, the general feel, the experience is similar. So you have this element of sameness, and that's what started our research. The fact that we were in Rome or in Calicut or in Warsaw, and we had the feeling we were in the same places. So there is this sameness. But what's interesting, that this sameness, it's totally decentralized. What do we mean by that? Think about Starbucks. Starbucks has a very clear aesthetics, but it's aesthetics that it's designed centrally. There is a design office somewhere in Seattle, or I don't know where they are now actually, that figures out what cafes should look like, should feel like, what the experience should be. And they have different categories. They're obviously not all the same. If you've got the chance to go, I don't know, to the Starbucks roastery in Milan, which is in a grand old post office, it's not your common Starbucks, but you can see that there is a design that is shared by other similar grand roasteries that Starbucks is creating. And the Starbucks cafes feel a little bit the same wherever you are in the world. So in that case, the sameness, this similarity is centralized. There is a central office. That happens with, I don't know, McDonald's. That happens with many chains, the W Hotel. Here, there is no central place where the design is developed. But at the same time, elements of this design, the design and architecture elements we've discussed, pop up all over the place. Why is that? We think that the reason for this is social media, and especially visual social media, in particular Instagram, TikTok. For slightly older people, maybe Pinterest or Facebook. But now, somehow, not only the restaurant owners, the cafe owners, the store owners post their pictures, but the customers themselves participate in the production of the communication. You go to a restaurant, you take a picture, you put it on your Instagram account, and you tag the place. You take a picture of, a cute plating or an interesting lighting fixture or an interesting design element. You put it on your Pinterest. So somehow the consumers become the co-producers of this style. And that allows people all over the world to see what's happening in other places, what's cool, what's trending. And it creates expectation. If I'm in Rome, I go to Brooklyn and I expect Brooklyn to look in a certain way. Or if I go to Bangkok, I would expect, sort of typical places and whatnot, but it would also expect that some cool, places, cafes might look like, what I've seen in Brooklyn. But especially the people in Bangkok want to have an experience that connect them with the cool places in Brooklyn or in other trendy cities, plural. So there is this circulation of images, of design elements, architectural elements, but also of practices, what dishes should look like. Now, very often, chefs design plate their recipes in ways that look good on Instagram. And so we think that this global aspect, this decentralized sameness, is deeply connected with these new ways of exchanging images on social media. At the same time, people will also want to have an experience of the local, as I pointed out already, with the Azulejos in Tijuana. Here we have a few examples. On the left, it's a place I went to in Calicut, in the Kerala state, India, where lots of global Brooklyn places, elements are there. You can see the wood, the recycled chairs, the recycled tables, the bulbs, the Edison bulbs. But at the same time, there were lots of elements from India and from that specific place. Maybe the picture is a little small, but you can see those milk containers hanging. And those are the containers that, you know, people would put on the back of their bikes. They would gather the milk from farmers and then distribute it in the city. There would be old objects from old Calicut. This is also, I forgot to mention, a shared design element. The presence of old objects taken out of their original context and used just as decoration, and somehow to give a sense of being real, of being connected with the past, and mostly with an analogic past, which is sort of cute because, as we've discussed, the diffusion of this aesthetic, it's very much the consequence of the digital revolution. But maybe because of that, there is this love for old objects, for analogic objects, you know, old typewriters, old radios, vinyl records. These are elements that also come alive, for instance, when there is a live DJ in a cafe that only uses vinyls. Now you can see it all over the place. So there is this desire of connecting with the past and desire to connect with the local. On the right, these are pictures that a friend sent from a cafe in Chiang Mai in northwest of Thailand. The architecture, I didn't put the pictures of the architecture because it's full-on global Brooklyn. The same place could have been in Rome or in Paris. But there is the desire of bringing also Thai elements. And so, for instance, in this case, is that, you know, some of the coffee is actually grown in the back of the cafe or very close by. They grow some of the herbs on place, and herbs that connect with, you know, specific Thai flavors. So every place find ways to connect with the local while maintaining this general feel of global Brooklyn. As we mentioned from the beginning, global Brooklyn is very much connected with gentrification. So at times you have old neighborhoods, old industrial neighborhoods, that have been abandoned during the transition from, you know, industrial societies to post-industrial society. Society that now is much more based on services, on finance, on the digital. So there were whole buildings that were abandoned, whole neighborhoods that were abandoned. Here we have a couple of examples. On the left, you have the Mikkeller brewery in Denmark, in Copenhagen. It was an old warehouse, and the brewery started making their artisanal beer in there. And now it's become a very popular hangout place for people in Copenhagen. And around it, other old buildings and warehouses are also being turned into breweries, into cafes, into restaurants that embrace this aesthetic, but also have a certain preference from the point of view of the menu for sort of artisanal stuff. So it can be the artisanal beers, the natural wines, can be third-way coffee, can be handmade fermented vegetables. There is this aspect of, you know, going back to something that requires the intervention of people. It's not just bought industrially mass-produced food. On the right, there is an image from LX factory in Lisbon, which was also an industrial compound, basically, that had been partially abandoned, and now it's become one of the most trendy places in Lisbon to hang out in the evening. Tons of restaurants, bars, cafes, galleries, stores, and this is what it looks like. So In some places, gentrification happened in industrial locations that had been abandoned. And I've seen those, I don't know, in Krakow, in India. But sometimes this doesn't happen where there are abandoned spaces, but this happened where there are communities living. So what the consequence of gentrification becomes displacement. And this is actually what's happening in Brooklyn. So you have these new waves of young people, of artists, of creative types, of students, and now just, you know, normal people, mid-aged people that like to live in fashionable neighborhoods, then move onto Brooklyn. The consequence of that, for instance, rents are through the roof. They become so expensive that the original people that live there have to move out. They get displaced. Somehow, sometimes old buildings are torn down and rebuilt, with creating new buildings that somehow, though, have this post-industrial feel. As you can see in the picture on the right, you know, this was a construction site, and somebody wrote more stuff for rich people, more Kunderberg instead of Williamsburg. Williamsburg is one of the most fashionable neighborhoods in Brooklyn now. These are very often very well-meaning people. They just want to be in a cool place. They just want to hang out in nice bars and cafes and restaurants. They want to be around people like them. But their presence creates raises in rents, pushes people. The new stores, the new restaurants are too expensive for those who used to live in that neighborhood. So between the rents and the cost of life, they move out. So in this case, gentrification is connected with displacement. And at times there is also full-on appropriation of all cultural spaces. These are examples from Chicago. A friend of mine sent it to me. And those were old, so originally they were built by the Czechs from Czechoslovakia that moved there at the end of the 19th century as factories or breweries as part of their production life. And then the whole neighborhood, this is called Pilsen, the neighborhood is Pilsen, became Hispanic. So lots of Mexican immigrants from Central America. And now you have this influx of gentrification that basically erases the presence of the Hispanics that had been there for 50 years, 70 years, and try to bring back the places and connect to the history that was before the Hispanics. So for instance, the Czechoslovakian beer places and whatnot. So very often, these dynamics are also connected with issues of class, sometimes with issues of ethnicity, depending on where you are. So I would finish here, and I'll go back to video. Let's see if it works. Yes, stop screen. So in case there are questions or comments, now I can read them.
Fabio, thanks. Was really great, your talk. I think everyone is inspired. When you were talking about the blackboards and all the messages and statements, it reminds me to the work of Candy Chang, Before I Die. She was putting this chalkboard you see in the buildings. But I think you tackle a lot of really important elements, the centralizing sameness. We're waiting now for some of the questions. We don't have questions at the moment. I don't know if someone wants to add any question.
I see a comment from YouTube. Yo vivo en Brooklyn, me apasiona el área de diseño de nueva experiencia en lo que es la comida. So this, you know, part of this new population in Brooklyn are creative people, are designers, are artists. And so they get used to this look, and then, they integrate in their own work. And so there is this multiplying effect that I find quite interesting.
I have a question. Let's see. If you were talking about this kind of decentralized sameness, like how visual social media, how platforms like Pinterest or Facebook or TikTok is, helping in this kind of understanding what is cool, what is normal, and normalizing all these elements and spaces. Any tip you will give to the audience? What do we need to do? What can we do with that?
I think so. It depends if you want to use it. If you're a designer or if you're a restaurant owner, you might want to learn how to somehow take advantage of these trends. Somehow you cannot control the customers, but you can create, I don't know, corner that are particularly cute and that people will want to take pictures in front of. So you have, I don't know, restaurants that have an old wall and they put stuff on it so that becomes visually appealing, and so you will have all the people taking selfies in front of them. They will choose certain tables or certain tableware that are particularly visually appealing for Instagram. Same thing with the plating. So what they can do is just somehow entice the customers to become co-producers. This works well. Of course, very often now restaurant owners, cafe owners are also very good at using social media to promote themselves. For instance, the whole movement of food trucks. I didn't talk about food trucks, but the aesthetic of the food trucks is very much connected with this. If you think about it, the food truck is not new. The food truck was a really working class way of getting food. There would be a truck in front of a factory making tacos for, I don't know, $2, or making sandwiches. Now the food truck is a design experience. You have a theme. You have a design that reflects the theme. You have a communication that reflects the theme. You have a Twitter account so that you can tell your followers, okay, at this time I'll be there, come, I will be making this one-time kind of sandwich, sort of thing. Young designers, young restaurateurs working together have become very good at doing this. And as a matter of fact, now there is also the expectation, in a way, from consumers. And it's not by chance, that in many design schools and in actually food, also gastronomy schools, this aspect of social communication is very much studied and taught. How do you make a cool Instagram post? How do you become effective on Twitter, and so on?
Super. Mm-hmm. We have a question actually from Andrés Sicard. He's saying, ¿cómo ves esas miradas o estas prácticas en una época de pandemia? How you see this in a pandemic era or moment?
That's become quite, well, first of all, quite a problem for businesses, for stores and for restaurants. If guests cannot go, it becomes complicated. But at the same time, people have become creative. So, for instance, in New York, in New Jersey, where I live, many of these places have created outdoors spaces where they can serve food. But of course, there are outdoor spaces of all the restaurants, of all the cafes, and all the bars next to each other. So how do you differentiate yourself? And what they do is they try to transmit the same aesthetics that they have indoors in these new outdoor spaces, sometimes very successfully. They've created sort of new versions of their old aesthetics indoors. Sometimes they create windows where they can give food to take away. And so there is a lot of thinking that goes into, for instance, the packaging, the style of the window, The menus, how will I put the menu online? How do I reach people? Again, the communication, the social media becomes very important. I think overall, it's still early to know where we're going with this and what the impact of the pandemic will be. But I think I already see, and I was in Poland doing research about this specifically, there is the desire for a sense of comfort, a sense of reality. So the very upscale, very expensive restaurants are not working too well. Unless, it's the world famous restaurant, people will keep on going. But in every city, there were expensive restaurants that are more or less in crisis. The mid-range restaurants are doing very well. And many of these global Brooklyn places do fall in that mid-range. They're not cheap, but they're not expensive either. There is a lot of attention to the quality of ingredients, this attention for artisanal elements. And I think now all these elements create comfort. And it's something that I think consumers look for, right now. And they don't want fake stuff. We've been through too much in a way. But who knows? I mean, now in New York and New Jersey, where I live, things were bouncing back real nicely. We were allowed to be indoors without masks, and that brought restaurants back. But now the Delta variant, what's the consequence of that? And how many people are vaccinated? How many are not? How many people do not want to get vaccinated? These are issues that do impact the restaurant world, even if they are, there is no control over them.
Yeah, totally. Do we have any other question? I don't know if someone from the public wants to. We don't have yet. Also, was really interesting, Fabio, how you were talking about the objects itself and the desire of connecting with the past, also, and with the local. And also these new objects that are gonna, are appearing also in the society.
Yeah. Well, there is a question from Repa. What is the keyword for food design, especially from indigenous food commodity? It is the same concept, food design, as future food? Ooh, that's a very complicated question. Very deep one. And the previous question was from Andres Sicard, that has been working a lot on these themes in Colombia. Because designers also have a role in supporting indigenous foods, indigenous productions, indigenous dishes. And very often that happens through the language of global Brooklyn, which I find very interesting. I've seen, for instance, the place I showed in Calicut was serving traditional local desserts, while other more modern or modern-looking cafes were offering very modern, foreign, in a way, desserts. This place wanted to make the food part of this sense of the past, of the local, in a way. So I think that there is a way in which the aesthetics can be paired together with the attention for indigenous foods, their productions, their qualities. Maybe, I don't know, on the famous blackboards, you can explain where the food come from, where the producers are, what they do. You can have something on the menu. You can use your website and your social media to explain also, the work of the indigenous communities. What's the risk there? There can be an exploitation of the local indigenous tradition just to make something successful and cute. Probably that can be avoided if also members of the indigenous communities are involved in the store, in the restaurant, in the cafe. I don't know if a community has very specific, I don't know, honey production. I'm just making that up. Is there a way to highlight the community on the package? Is there a way for members of the community maybe to be in the store sometimes and do presentations or do, I don't know, cooking experiences? And above all, how much of the money that the restaurant makes or the cafe makes goes to the community? Are the products paid properly? Do they get a fair price for the products, or are they being exploited? So I think the potential is there. It all depends on the context and on the relationships between the owners and the managers of the store, the cafe, with the representatives of the indigenous community.
I think it's a great answer. Let's see if we have one more before closing. I don't know if someone wants to ask something else. We have Fabio here. Chun chun.
It's also the last session of a very long morning, so
I think everyone is a bit hungry. We saw a lot of stuff. You are talking about honey. We saw a lot of projects. I think everyone is just thinking what we're gonna eat. So again, Fabio, it was a pleasure. Thanks for the presentation. You shared a lot of really insights for everyone. I think everyone will use it. So thanks again for coming. And we will. And we will finish the first part of the day, and then we'll come back at 4 to talk a bit more with new speakers. So thanks again. Bye-bye.